last presentation for the day. Really excited about this. Very, very good. Now, sister of mine, founder and director of Black Skeptics Los Angeles and the Women's Leadership Project, a Black feminist mentoring and civic engagement program for girls of color in South Angeles high schools. She is the author of several literary works, including the 2020 release Humanists in the Hood, Unapologetically Black Feminist, and Heretical, and the play, Unapologetically Black Feminist and Heretical, and the play Narcolepsy, Inc., which premiered at the Hollywood Fringe Film Festival in 2018. Her book, Moral Combat, was released in 2011 and is the first book on atheism published by an African-American woman. She is also one of the 5 fierce humanists featured on the cover of the July-August 2018 issue of the Humanist magazine, and is also one of the co-producers of the Women of Color Beyond Belief Conference. She is also the recipient of the 2020 Harvard Humanist Award, along with myself and Ijoma Oluo, was the Secular Student Alliance's Backbone Award winner in 2016, and was named Secular Woman's 2013 Woman of the Year. Ladies and gentlemen, I am proud to present to you our final presenter for the day, Ms. Sikivu Hutchinson.
Thanks so much, Mandisa, for the intro, and I am just so appreciative and grateful for you and your visionary work. And my sister Bria, I know she's in the house. Shout out of love, gratitude, and appreciation always. And congratulations on the 10th anniversary. And thanks to all of the viewers in the Black atheist heathen community for pushing forward. And I also want to give a shout out to Samantha McGuire for helping me with this technical hurdle that we were trying to get across for the past half hour. So I'm going to talk about the Standing for Black Girls Coalition that we created in South LA this past fall. And I'm going to speak specifically about the intersection of the pandemic, ending sexual violence, and creating Black feminist, humanist intersectional spaces for Black girls, and the urgency of that for radical Black humanists. A few years ago, during casual conversation, an older relative of mine, who I'll call Ren, revealed that she had been sexually abused. And Ren was born during the Great Depression in the Deep South. She was from a generation of women accustomed to being told that the violence they experienced in their homes and families was the natural cost of being Black, female, and poor. Ren was that strong Black woman, the prototypical Black woman that many of us were raised by. What the elders used to call a race woman, devout, heavily armored, but guarding a tender heart, a monster work ethic, and a take no prisoners wit that dazzled and infuriated. And she couldn't understand why us, quote, younger folks made such a fuss about rape and sexual assault. She couldn't understand why women of a more so-called liberated generation didn't just buck up and move on, because as she told me quite candidly, I was raped practically every day of my life. Ren was part of the African-American exodus of the Great Migration period. She was fiercely proud that she moved to California, the so-called golden state of opportunity, on her own. She was a union advocate. She was a shop steward who, quote, broke the day with her fist and worked any odd job she could find to support her family. Her stiff upper lip trauma has painful resonance as COVID lays bare the disparities that survivors face in Black communities at the epicenter of the US's healthcare gulag as a form of state violence in and of itself. And so I begin with this anecdote because, in my view, the deep multi-generational trauma of sexual and domestic violence continues to reverberate in pandemic conditions where victims cannot easily escape, as we know their abusers. As the global #MeToo movement has shown, many of us continue to be silent and complicit when it comes to rape culture. And for this reason, I think Black humanists have a unique role to play in ending sexual and domestic violence, precisely because this regime relies upon normalizing faith-based victim blaming and shaming. Because if you speak about rape as a form of terroristic power and control, at the end of the day, you are not just a race traitor, but you're a faith traitor. And in my book, Humanists in the Hood, I discuss how ending rape culture relates to the principles of radical humanism and Black feminism. Radical humanism is based on the primacy of bodily autonomy, and it's symbolized by this dynamic of self-determination. It's symbolized specifically by abortion on demand without apology, by birth control on demand without apology, by health and wellness on demand and without apology. Radical humanism demands an end to the police or the carceral state, which is symbolized by the courts, by the jails, by the surveillance regime that is disproportionately imposed upon the dehumanized bodies of people of color, that disproportionately siphons resources away from communities of color in rural and urban communities, away from systems of care, and again, into these endless regimes of mass incarceration and state suppression. When we're talking about rape culture, we need to be very specific and very explicit about the impact in our communities. Nationwide, African-American women and girls continue to have some of the highest rates of sexual violence, intimate partner violence, and domestic abuse in the US. And by the time they turn 18, according to the Black Women's Health Project and according to the Black Women's Blueprint, it's estimated that 40 to 60% of Black girls have experienced sexual abuse. According to the National Center for Victims of Crime, Black women are 2.5 times more likely to be murdered by men than white women. Black women between the ages of 15 to 35 are more likely to die at the hands of a current or former intimate partner than any other group in the country. Further, Black girls have some of the highest rates of domestic sex trafficking. Next slide, please. And so this regime of domestic sex trafficking manifests itself for Black girls in this endless cycle of arrest, conviction, and incarceration. Arrest, conviction, and incarceration that often leads to being permanently pushed out of school when they are minors, being unhoused, being underemployed, and again, being pushed into prostitution as adults. According to the Department of Justice, only 1 in 15 Black women report sexual violence, while Black women and girls across sexuality and gender identity, cis, straight, queer, and trans identifying are more likely to be sexually abused and harassed by law enforcement. And so in the time that it takes for me to say these words, a Black girl will have been sexually assaulted and a Black woman murdered by a husband, by a lover, by an ex-partner, by a relative. In the time that it takes for us to cavalierly tweet or to post on Facebook or to post on Instagram, a Black child will be molested by a trusted family member who has groomed them with promises, who has whispered to them to stay silent and not air the dirty laundry of their family, of their church, of their community. In the time that it takes us to casually tweet, post on Facebook, or post on Instagram, a Black queer or straight girl will be trafficked over and over again, because as many of us know, the rape of a minor, disguised as prostitution, is now a more valuable capitalist street commodity than drugs. And so the images that you see on the screen are from the prelude to the Standing for Black Girls Coalition rally that we held on October 17th, where we wanted to lift up the names of not just contemporary victims of rape culture, but historical victims of rape culture, like Recy Taylor, who was a young African-American mother brutally gang raped in Alabama in the 1940s by a mob of white men. And she was a rallying point, a flashpoint for Black women's activism against sexual terrorism, which was a preface to the Montgomery bus boycotts and other actions in the Deep South. And as many of you may know, Rosa Parks was at the forefront of that movement in the 1940s as an investigator for the NAACP. This young woman here was Toyin Salah, who was a BLM activist. She was sexually assaulted by a Black man in her community and murdered. This image on the right is of our young leaders at King Drew, and you're going to be seeing them in a clip at the end of my talk. And so these hidden in plain sight realities have been ripped open as a result of decades of anti-violence activism. But as a survivor and a mentor to Black girls, I'm going to have to say that I am reminded every day that the scope and atrocity of sexual violence has not changed significantly over the course of my lifetime. I'm reminded that we are frequently told to step back and wait until white supremacy has been eradicated before we can begin to prioritize rape culture and sexual terrorism. And yes, social media has amplified rape as a pandemic within a pandemic. Yes, it has provided a platform for virtual and real-time organizing, but at the end of the day, we need to be crystal clear that there continues to be a culture of silence, even among folks that are so-called allied with anti-racism, anti-sexism movement organizing. These are folks who somehow don't see the raped and violated bodies of Black girls day in and day out. When it comes time for folks to disrupt the complicity of African-American communities in the normalization and institutionalization of child sexual abuse, especially around how Black girls specifically are hypersexualized through misogynoir, these allies, these partners, these so-called accomplices are dramatically and egregiously MIA. This past summer and in the fall, as I mentioned at the outset of the talk, the Women's Leadership Project, supported by Black Skeptics, was inspired to start the Standing for Black Girls Coalition and rally. And this was catalyzed by a number of different dynamics. First, of course, the pandemic and the racial justice uprisings for Black lives highlighted the disparities in systems of care and mental health. Second, and this is a big point of contention, the hashtag #MeToo movement, despite the forerunning work of folks like hashtag #MeToo founder Tarana Burke, in my view, has not adequately addressed the disproportionate impact of rape culture in African-American communities. And I really contend that hashtag #MeToo has largely shied away from the role religious predation and faith-based cultures of victim blaming, shaming, and respectability politics and policing politics play in African-American families and communities. And so the slide that you are seeing on the screen is our coalition flyer for the rally, for the call to action, with a number of the organizations, both local to LA and national, that stepped up and supported. The coalition includes LA-based Black women and girls-led gender justice organizations. It's supported by affinity groups like Afro-Les Productions, Aisha Simmons' organization, Peace Over Violence, Rights for Girls, and our own Women of Color Beyond Belief. And during the rally, you spearheaded the community action in South LA's Leimert Park, which is a vibrant platform for Black voices and Black advocacy and Black art. And although there were some who stepped up to support the action, there were also many in the community who did not. And I believe this underscores the difficulty, again, of organizing around sexual violence from within. And these are some of the images from the rally. We need really look no further when we're talking about complicity and silence than the toxic chorus of community folks who vilified the Black victims of high-profile predators like R. Kelly, Bill Cosby, and Russell Simmons, to name just a few, After Kelly's crimes were globally exposed in Dream Hampton's documentary, Surviving R. Kelly, some Black men and women continued to have his back. And Hampton and the victims in the documentary received death threats. And Hampton has spoken of how difficult it was to get Black people to take the claims of Black female victims seriously. And this is largely, again, due to the stigma associated with feminism, specifically Black feminism, continuing the legacy of the Kami River Collective, and the stigma of being perceived as anti-Black male. The Standing for Black Girls Coalition demands center on the creation of a regional task force focused on Black girls, led by Black girls. And that's an important caveat. Focused on Black girls, led by Black girls, not dictated by Black adults, not centered on the issues and the policy items that we are projecting onto millennial and Gen Z youth. The task force would both craft and identify public policies advancing the development of housing, safe spaces, after-school programs, treatment and mental health and wellness resources for Black girls across sexualities in partnership with local and state government and CBOs. And so in addition, we created a wellness initiative pilot that provides free secular humanist group and individual counseling and therapy for Black girl domestic violence survivors between the ages of 16 to 24 across sexual orientation. And this pilot begins at the end of the month, and it is going to be spearheaded by a young Black feminist, culturally responsive therapist out of Colorado, who is secular humanist, named Suandria Hall. Another target that we're pushing for is a statewide resolution within California that mandates sexual violence prevention education that is culturally responsive, that it is intersectional, that is trauma informed for K through 12. The coalition is also supporting the ratification of the Violence Against Women Act, which obviously has been waylaid by the Republican stronghold on Congress. In addition to Massachusetts Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley's push-out bill to redress the criminalization of Black girls and girls of color in K through 12. We know that pandemic shutdowns have led to an increase in calls to domestic violence hotlines and an uptick in the need for mental health resources, shelter, and other forms of victim assistance to survivors. What is not widely known or discussed is that shelter-in-place orders are especially difficult for Black girls and girls of color who, even under normal circumstances, have to juggle a million things, have to juggle schoolwork, have to juggle caregiving, have to juggle household responsibilities, have to prioritize everyone under the sun except for themselves. And now many have the added burden of being at home, and we recognize that home is not Ozzie and Harriet, 2.5 kids, picket fence, and a single family home. Home could be a group home. Home could be a camper. Home could be a shelter. Home could be a damn mattress on the street, given the crisis and the epidemic of unhoused African-American folks here in LA County, the biggest county in the nation and one of the richest citadels in the nation. And so home is where many young people continue to be exposed to their harm doers, to their abusers, without any relief due to the shutdowns, due to the transition to distance learning, due to them being disengaged from adult advocates, school resources, and safe spaces that provide havens. Another issue that we are focusing on intensively with the Wellness Initiative is the stress and burnout related to these gender-specific duties. And our imperative during the pandemic has been creating safe spaces for them to write, for them to talk, for them to reflect, for them to self-care, and again, to advocate for community issues in collaboration with other girls of color. While feelings of depression, fear, and anxiety are pervasive symptoms of COVID's staggering mental health impact, Black girls have always struggled with this cultural demand that they repress their emotions and keep it moving. And as many of you know, as Black women, there is this pervasive tradition of Black girls and women being told to just pray or trust that God has a plan. And again, keep it moving against the odds. Another dynamic here is the lack of a culturally competent lens from psychotherapists when it comes to these intersectional dynamics like misogynoir and adultification, or the perception that Black girls are older, less innocent, criminal, and more violent than non-Black girls. And this informs the high rates of suspension, expulsion, and push-out of African-American girls in our K-12 system. This was a major concern for WLP students who found that nearly 70% of Black girl sexual violence survivors had not received therapeutic help or intervention. And this was a survey that they conducted with over 150 South LA youth this past summer. This stat is compounded by the absence of non-faith-based or non-spiritual therapeutic options for youth. And this is something that comes up time and again, that young people are not able to find secular humanist outlets for therapy, self-care, and counseling. This image on the right, actually I wanted to highlight, this is one of our workshops that we conducted where we're looking at Say Her Name in the aftermath of the terroristic execution of Breonna Taylor, but also linking it to #MeToo. And so the image on the left of the square is a whiteboard from Dorsey High School where we have a pilot, and the young people actually reported, the young women reported on all of the aggressive and microaggressive incidents that they had experienced around sexual harassment and sexual violence on a day-to-day basis. Everything from being catcalled, to being fingered, to being touched, to being raped. Another item that we foreground is the fact that over-reliance on faith remedies for healing rather than humanist alternatives can be especially toxic for queer and trans youth who are dealing with faith-based discrimination. Because not only are youth of color more likely to be subjected to psychologically toxic faith-based homophobia and transphobia in their schools, families, and communities, but as I discussed in the final chapter of Humanist in the Hood, an increasing number are identifying as both secular and queer. And this is a nexus that is really important if we're talking about creating these culturally responsive intersectional systems of care in K-12, where often there is not any substantive attention to the fact that Black trans youth and Black non-binary youth have a markedly different experience from white queer youth. In her 2019 anthology, Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Violence, Black queer activist and filmmaker Aisha Simmons argues, quote, "It is my affirmation that every single one of us will make the commitment to refrain from marginalizing or worse, condoning child sexual abuse or any other form of gender-based violence in the name of any, quote, greater issue, which in communities of color often means solely focusing on white supremacy. The eradication of racism and white supremacy alone," she continues, "will not make our communities safe. We should not have to be murdered by white vigilantes, the police, or any other apparatus of the state in order for our communities to believe harm has been committed. For many survivors of child sexual abuse, physical death is not necessarily the worst thing that can happen to us, especially when we have to engage with our harm doers over and over again without any form of accountability." And so again, we go back to, why is this a Black humanist concern that demands urgency? We look around and we see a deepening climate of fascist terrorism and violence that has erupted after Black folks have predicted it for over a decade with the Tea Party, birther, white nationalist trifecta. And we know that this latest eruption is just business as usual. It will not be assuaged by the removal of Trump. We know that it not only has deep roots in white Christian nationalism, states' rights militias, and the neo-Confederacy, but in what has increasingly been identified as a violent anti-abortion terrorism that has been allowed to fester for decades. And it will only be redressed if there is pressure on and grassroots mobilization around the new Democratic majority in Congress to bend towards the arc of justice, as Dr. King once said, and more specifically toward the abolition of all forms of state violence, who have been at the forefront of the resistance have shown us. And these words resonate when I think, coming back full circle, about Ren's generation, that Great Depression era generation, and those before her. I think about Alice Walker's profound quote in her book, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, where she talked about having a genius of a great-great-great-grandmother who wanted to sculpt, who wanted to be an artist, but was not able due to this regime of sexual terrorism. And so these were Black women who were steeped not only in the trauma of this regime and the shame of ritualized anti-Black misogynist violence, but in the fighting power, in the creativity, in the resilience of thriving survival, identifying the fight against sexual terrorism as a form, critically, of Black liberation struggle. And as an example for these generations that we are trying to lift up, who refuse to shut up, who refuse to buck up, and who refuse, most crucially, to be respectable. And so apropos of that, I wanted to show a brief clip of our Black feminist youth leaders at King Drew. This particular clip is coming from our Girls Build initiatives that we began in 2019. And in early 2020, it was disrupted by the pandemic. This was one of the last events slash films that we were able to do before the pandemic was declared. And it is a film that was shot by one of our amazingly talented youth filmmakers, Zori Petrus. So if we can roll that, it's very short.
Hi, my name is Ashley Harris, and I go to King Drew, and I'm a senior, and I want to be a sports medicine doctor, and I want to be a photographer.
Hi, my name is Mariah. I'm a freshman at King Drew, and I want to be an OBGYN.
Hi, my name is Nayagisha. I'm a freshman, and I went at King Drew, and I want to be an OBGYN.
My name is Anaya Williams. I'm a senior, and I want to be a counselor psychologist.
Hi, my name is Deshaunda Thompson. I'm a senior, and I want to be a neonatal nurse.
Hi, my name is Rena Lee. I'm a senior and I want to be a web developer.
And we are
The Women's Leadership Project. Hashtag Black Feminism. Hashtag period.
Black girls have the highest rates of domestic sex trafficking in the U.S.
Over 35% of Latinas have experienced sexual assault in their lifetime.
Nearly 60% of African American girls have experienced sexual abuse by the age of 18.
African American and Latinx girls are experiencing higher rates of sexual harassment, sexual violence, and intimate partner violence.
What is WLP doing to change and counter that?
Within our project, we are focusing in on sexual harassment and sexual violence prevention education.
Aren't we also having peer-to-peer education and outreach?
Yeah, we are.
So it's kind of like hashtag sexual harassment empowerment training.
Yeah, hashtag me too.
Hashtag Black feminism.
Hashtag Black excellence.
Okay.
But most of our stories go unnoticed and unreported by our mainstream media and in our communities.
and that's information on where you can get Humanists in the Hood. The young people that were featured in the video have either gone on to 11th grade. Actually, no, there's a 10th grader in that video. We have a couple of youth that have graduated, and one of the young women is Clay Wesley, who's a former foster care youth, first in her family to go to college, and recently graduated and has come back to work with WLP as a program coordinator via the LA County Youth at Work program. So those are some of the initiatives that we put in place over the past 15 some odd years that Women's Leadership Project has been in existence in South LA, predominantly Black and Latinx high schools. Okay, I am done, and if there are any questions. And thanks so much again for the technical support, Samantha, and this has been a really wonderful experience that I'm quite proud to have been a part of.
Thank you, Sikivu. The in-person audience is clapping as well. We do have time for a few questions before we break, before we adjourn for the day, and we're going to take the in-person audience question first.
Hi, so I had a question for you as far as handling the Black community's approach to what is happening with young girls. I'm from Ohio, and I've pretty much kicked my, I guess what you would call it, collective Black group to the curb, basically because it's a situation where when we have our meets, the elders, quote unquote elders, are wanting you to kind of dismiss the issue of what is happening with the conflict between Black men and Black women within the Black community. It's like, okay, just be worried about the collective. If we were back in the old days, the elder women wouldn't concern themselves with this. It's you younger women, you know, they would be more concerned about the collective. Meanwhile, you got all of these young girls being sexually abused. People still don't want to acknowledge the fact that when a girl gets on a bus and a bunch of boys are filling on her butt, that's her first rape, actually. That's her first rape. That she's having to deal with, and she's going to grow up all through her life being taught that this is acceptable. So what do you do when you want to be concerned about the collective, but you're being told as a woman that these things that happen to girls and women should be ignored? How do you even continue to be a part of the collective?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I would say is that it's an educational process. So Women's Leadership Project is not just something that we do within a Black feminist context for African American girls and Latinx girls and Indigenous girls. We also work with young boys, recognizing that young boys are coming from a perspective of objectification, commodification, and normalization of rape culture that they have inherited. This is not something that they roll out of the womb and are automatically knowing with regard to their identities. This is something that they're indoctrinated into. So I think that as adults, it's incumbent upon us to provide these intersectional, culturally responsive spaces for African American youth across gender, across identity, to unlearn the toxicity of misogynoir, which is anti-Black misogyny, to look at this as a form of normalized enslavement intersecting with rape culture, to look at this within a historical lens when it comes to the objectification and the sale, the theft of Black women's reproductive and productive agency. This is a legacy that we are living. When you talk about a girl who gets onto a bus and is pawed on, is assaulted by Black men and boys, and no one says a damn thing about it, this is part of that legacy of toxic rape culture connected to enslavement of Black women's bodies. And I think if we're able to concretize that in our practice within the classroom and in these micro conversations that we have with Black boys, we have to step up and have these conversations with Black boys. As a matter of course, the same kind of conversations, I might add, that we have with Black boys about the normalization of state violence and the carceral regime, and them being pulled over by the police, and them being targeted and profiled by the police, we need to have those same kinds of conversations when it comes to the normalization of rape culture and misogyny in our everyday lives.
Thank you very much for that awesome, powerful response, Sikivu. There was a couple of questions that came in on the virtual chat, and one of them is, I'm trying to see if I get this, if I can get this correct. Can you comment on the tension, dissent between Black Lives Matter and the reality that many of the men who many Black women were marching for were serial sexual and intimate partner violence offenders against Black girls and women?
Yeah, I think this is all of a piece with respect to the prior question, that there is this disconnect, that there is this erasure that exists in our communities, that is a painful thing to confront, but we must. We have to step up. We have to continue to identify the paradox of Black women rallying around Black men at all costs, sacrificing, being on the front lines of the resistance, being the mouthpiece of change when it comes to dismantling the regime of state violence. And yet Black men being MIA and being perpetrators and being, let's break it down, predators when it comes to sexual violence and sexual harassment and sex trafficking, which I cannot emphasize enough is an utter plague and a cancer in African American communities when it comes to our economic self-determination. So we also have to make a connection to these systems of power when it comes to enfranchisement financially and economically. The fact that we're not going to be able to generate multi-generational wealth if we don't have enfranchisement within the reproductive justice sphere, if we don't have enfranchisement within K through 12 education, where greater and greater numbers of Black youth are being locked up and pushed out, suspended, and expelled ad nauseum, ad infinitum. African American girls have greater chances of being suspended and expelled than do non-Black girls. Are second to Black boys in being suspended and expelled. And so this dynamic of suspension and expulsion is not just criminalization, but it's also hypersexualization. If we look at what's happening with African American girls in the LAUSD, the Los Angeles Unified School District, for example, just a snapshot, and getting back to the original question that was being posed about this paradox. African American girls are being criminalized, yes, because they're Black, yes, because they're being perceived as a threat, but the threat is linked to their sexuality. It's linked to them being perceived as more masculine, as more adult, getting back to what I referenced in the talk, which is a reference to the Georgetown University 2017 study that came out that found that these carceral systems that are imposed upon the bodies of Black girls emanate, again, from this slave legacy of the theft and the rape of Black women's bodies. And so vis-a-vis the original question, we as Black humanists have to continue to call out these contradictions, have to continue to say that Black lives matter, not just within the context of dismantling police violence and police brutality, but also within the context of enfranchising our minds, freeing our minds from these toxic structures of misogyny that are self-perpetuating, that are internalized.
That answered the last question that was going to be asked about how, which relates to how do we really try to, how do we try to impart more empowerment as far as sexuality in women? And that's a whole nother conversation that we could probably have for another day. But we are going to call it here. Thank you so much, Sikivu, for closing out our first day of our 10th anniversary celebration. Thank you.
Thank you. Much love. Much love.